Good morning. All right, this is a surprise ice day for us, so I apologize. I don't have any kind of spectacular opening for you. So I decided to share with you a bit of my glorious past. All right, so at some point in this video, you will see a banner pop up on the screen linking you to a video that you may be interested in seeing. So call it an Easter egg in video gaming terms. All right, but I won't tell you where it is. You got to watch the video to find out. Okay. So back when we actually had school in a real building, which was on Tuesday, we talked about Vatican II. We talked about two documents from there. We talked about Gaudium et Spes and Inter Mirifica. 7th and 8th hour, you need to just read over briefly the stuff on Inter Mirifica in here. It's on the means, instruments of social communication and media. Today I want to focus on Dignitatis Humanae. I mentioned that on Tuesday. It's a pretty big social document, okay? Well, it's not big in size, it's big in importance, all right? It's the Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom, okay? The reason it's so big is because, for one thing, it asserts religious freedom as a fundamental human right, and it's a whole document based on one right. But it also changed the way that a lot of Catholics thought about religious freedom. Okay, it was written largely by an American Jesuit priest named John Courtney Murray, but also Archbishop Karol Wojtyła, okay, the future John Paul II. So he was very influential in this document's drafting. He had a hand in Gaudium et Spes as well. So John Paul II was very much a Vatican II Pope. Okay, so think back to shortly after the French Revolution, Pope Gregory XVI issues Mirari Vos, which is a condemnation of several liberal ideas at the time, including the separation of church and state, freedom of conscience, and a variety of other things. Okay, so he condemns all of those things as new things that are not in conformity with the Catholic faith. That condemnation of separation of church and state and freedom of conscience, as well as freedom of worship, that continues down the line of popes up to Vatican II. Pope Leo XIII writes a document on religious freedom, freedom of conscience and worship, and condemns it. He says it's not a freedom at all. Okay, so we have to dig in to see what they actually mean in those documents in order to understand how that can work with what Vatican II says in Dignitatis Humanae. Okay, so Pope Gregory, Pope Leo, their idea of religious freedom was different from Vatican II's. All right, so they understood, they were looking at freedom as the traditional view of the ability to will the good. Okay, that's what freedom means. It means having the ability to will the good. Okay, more technically, this means being able to use your reason and your will to order your actions or direct your actions to your final end, which would be your fulfillment in God Himself. Okay, so freedom is being able to direct your actions towards the thing you were made for. Okay. Only by directing yourself towards your final end, or God, are you free to become the person that you were meant to be the being that you were meant to become, okay, which is the image of God in the world. Okay, so this is related to something else I mentioned earlier this week, which was the natural law. Okay, so morality corresponds with human nature. It's rooted in human nature. The morally good thing to do is also the thing which you were designed to do as a human being. Okay, so the good thing to do is the most human thing to do, because that's what's in accordance with your human nature. All right, so morality is not some external law that's imposed on us to limit our freedom. The moral law is an expression of what we were made to do as human beings anyway. Okay. So you can only become fully human by living a morally good life, and doing what you were made to do as a human being. Okay, freedom means being able to do what your nature demands that you do. Okay. All right. So, in order to will the good, first you have to know what the good is, and you also have to have the power to do it. Okay. So, knowing what the good is, in its fullest expression, means the Catholic faith. All right. So the full truth about the good is revealed and preserved in the Catholic faith. So in order to will it, you have to know it. In order to know it fully, you've got to know the Catholic faith. The power to do the good then comes not from within ourselves, okay? But it comes from the grace of God, which is given especially through the sacraments and other sources of grace, particularly within the Church, okay? Therefore, freedom, understood as this ability to will the good, is found only in its fullness by believing and living out the Catholic faith. Okay, so believing or practicing any other religion or being an atheist, that's actually the opposite of freedom. Okay, because it always involves believing and doing something that's not good, believing and doing something that's false and contrary to what you were made for. And so it actually limits and destroys your freedom and your ability to become fully developed and fulfilled as a human being. Okay, this is where you get this idea of the slavery of sin. Jesus says the truth will set you free. Okay, the truth will set you free because it allows you to become what you were meant to be. All right. So, as the popes up to Vatican II had addressed it, religious freedom in society exists when, I'm quoting Pope Leo XIII here, every man in the state may follow the will of God from a consciousness of duty and free from every obstacle, and obey his commands. Okay, I butchered that quote a little bit, but basically, the government and the people within society have to allow for the free practice of the Catholic faith. Okay, so man can freely obey the will of God and pursue God as his final end. That's what it means for religious freedom to exist in society. Okay. Now, the implication of this teaching, as it was understood prior to Vatican II, generally understood prior to Vatican II, is that the government has a responsibility then to promote the Catholic faith and to limit the expression of other religions as well as atheism. Okay, this is a matter of the common good, because the government has a responsibility to direct human beings towards the good, which means directing them towards Catholicism and limiting the expressions of other religions. Okay, meaning the government could censor things that were not Catholic. If somebody is writing against the Catholic faith, they could censor that. They could make laws against allowing, say, Protestants to evangelize within society, things like that. Okay, so the popes were not promoting religious persecution. Right? They're not promoting the persecution of non-Catholics, but stopping them, not even stopping them from worshiping necessarily, but stopping them from spreading their beliefs, particularly. Right? So, prior to Vatican II, religious freedom meant, in the Church, the government allowing for the free expression of the Catholic faith and promoting that. Dignitatis Humanae reaffirms what the previous popes had said about religious freedom, in the sense that freedom truly exists when you're following the truth without any other obstacles. Okay, so that traditional view of freedom is preserved in Dignitatis Humanae. What Vatican II does is draw a distinction between that type of freedom, that freedom to will the good, and freedom as freedom from coercion and restraint in pursuing religious truth in society. Okay. So it writes, this is a quote from Dignitatis Humanae, "This Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups or of any human power, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits." End quote. So it's a mouthful. But in other words, Dignitatis Humanae prohibits governments and other organizations from pressuring individuals or groups to practice any particular religion, or from restraining them from practicing their own religion, okay? Even if that's atheism. So all societies, the Council says, have a moral responsibility to recognize religious freedom in this sense, okay? And this freedom, they say, is based on the dignity of the human person. So as the Council puts it, as persons endowed with reason and free will, all men have the obligation to seek religious truth and conform their lives to that truth. So we have an obligation to seek the truth and to live according to it. But men cannot satisfy this obligation in a way that is in keeping with their own nature unless they enjoy both psychological freedom and immunity from external coercion. Okay. Because our obligation to seek the truth and to live according to the truth can only be fulfilled by the free use of our reason and will, which is to say, because faith must be freely chosen in order to be authentic, it's unacceptable for anyone or any group, any government, to try to coerce, which would be to pressure or force us to believe and live in accordance with the truth. Okay, that wouldn't be a real fulfillment of our moral obligation. Okay, and because this right has its foundation in the very nature of the human person, this right to this immunity from coercion continues to exist even in those who do not live up to their obligation of seeking the truth and adhering to it, and the exercise of this right is not to be impeded, provided that just public order be observed. Okay. In other words, because this is rooted in human nature and human dignity, even when somebody believes and practices the wrong thing, this right to be free from coercion still exists in them. Okay. All right. A couple of notes here. The preservation of just public order, it still allows for the government to do things like, say, prevent Satanists from performing human sacrifice, right? You have to preserve just public order. Human sacrifice violates just public order. Okay. This also does not prohibit governments from promoting Catholicism as the official state religion. A government can still have that as the state religion and still promote Catholicism, but it can't coerce people into becoming Catholic, and it can't limit non-Catholics from practicing their own faiths. Okay. As the Council puts it, the truth cannot impose itself except by virtue of its own truth, as it makes its entrance into the mind at once quietly and with power. Okay, so nothing can force you to believe the truth except truth itself. Okay, it speaks to your conscience. When you perceive the truth, you cannot resist it in a sense. Okay, you can resist it, okay, in some ways, but when you truly perceive it as it is, all right, it draws you to it. All right, so in the end, what Dignitatis Humanae really does is it changes the view that many Catholics, including the popes leading up to the Council, had of the role of the state in directing people towards the Catholic faith. Okay, basically, it requires that governments give religions and beliefs other than Catholicism, including atheism, more breathing room. Okay. So practices like state-sponsored inquisitions aimed at rooting out heresy, which had previously been done with church approval, those things are contrary to human dignity. Okay, they're contrary to the free pursuit of religious truth that the human person is entitled to. And what makes this a legitimate development of doctrine, rather than just a total reversal of what the popes had been saying beforehand, or previously established Catholic doctrine, is that there's also precedent within the Catholic tradition for allowing for this kind of religious freedom. Okay, the authors of Dignitatis Humanae look particularly to Jesus' example himself. What did Jesus do? He presented the truth, he rebuked those who did not follow it, but he never imposed the truth by force or coerced people into following him. Okay, so following Christ's example, that's why Dignitatis Humanae says what it does, says what it says. Okay, so within the great tradition of Catholicism, there are these two precedents, right? One is states limiting the freedom of non-Catholics and trying to pressure them into becoming Catholic for their own good. The intention was good here. But there's that precedent, and then there's the other approach, which is truth can only impose itself, okay? And it's following the example of Christ. And that's what Vatican II says ultimately is the one that's in accordance with human dignity, okay? As it says, as this dignity is known through the revealed Word of God and by reason itself, okay? So takeaways from Vatican II for Catholic social teaching. Number one, through Gaudium et Spes, Vatican II reaffirms and deepens the Church's social teaching, and especially it highlights and develops our understanding of human dignity and that dignity's central importance for Catholic social teaching. We'll talk more about that later. Inter Mirifica affirms our right to information and provides helpful guidance for those who produce media, including artists and directors, as well as for those of us who view it. Okay, that's become even more important since the Council. Finally, in Dignitatis Humanae, the Council affirms the fundamental human right to religious freedom or liberty, understood as freedom from coercion and restraint by the government and civil society in pursuing and living in accordance with religious truth. Okay, I'm trying to hurry here. Trying to get done before 20 minutes. Okay, I want to touch on, so that's Dignitatis Humanae. Boom, much more clearly written today, don't you think? Bolder marker. Now, I want to move on to Pope St. Paul VI. Okay, just spend the last few minutes talking about him. Sorry, you can't see that, can you? Two major social encyclicals, it says. All right. Paul VI, he succeeds St. John the 23rd when John the 23rd dies in 1963. This is after one session of Vatican II. So Paul VI comes on, he has to decide, am I going to keep going with the council or no? He does, obviously. And he guides and oversees the council in his final three sessions and the implementation of the council up through 1978, which is when he dies. In addition to finishing the council, after the council, Paul VI writes two major social encyclicals, the first being Populorum Progressio in 1967, the other being Humanae Vitae in 1968. We'll talk more about Humanae Vitae tomorrow. But Populorum Progressio I want to touch on right now. He follows in the same vein of John the 23rd's encyclicals, focusing on the development of nations. Okay, what Paul sees is the growing economic disparity between these wealthier nations and the poorer nations, and he sees that this wealth gap is destabilizing the world. And so he says this is going to basically become a disaster if we don't do anything about it. All right. So he identifies the problem as the weakening of brotherly ties between individuals and nations. In other words, a lack of solidarity or fraternal love between peoples. The poor are poor because of a lack of charity on the part of the wealthy, he says. So he's emphasizing the need for solidarity within society and between societies. So the primary responsibility, he says, for closing this wealth gap is it falls upon wealthy individuals and wealthy nations. Okay, wealthy individuals and nations have to do what they can to assist poor individuals and underdeveloped nations, primarily by aiding in their development. Monetary aid is good as a temporary kind of a band-aid, okay? But what you really need to do is help them to develop so they can provide for themselves, both on an individual human level and on a national level, okay? So welfare, for instance, is only good as a temporary measure, okay? That's never the goal, to have somebody just be on welfare for their whole life, because that's actually not fulfilling them as a person. All right, so to this end, all right, he actually promotes kind of not the opposite of subsidiarity. All right, we talked about subsidiarity, where higher level societies like the government have to respect and promote the functioning of lower level societies like the family. He says, though, that he affirms the right and the duty of governments to expropriate, meaning tax or otherwise take possession of property or wealth from individuals, to redistribute it to people who need it when individuals fail to fix these unjust disparities in wealth. Okay. In other words, when people within society are not fixing the wealth gap themselves, the government has a right to intervene and to, through taxes or other forms of expropriation, redistribute wealth. Okay, so the government has a right to institute a welfare type policy. Okay. All right, so this doesn't contradict what previous popes had said. It's just emphasizing the other end of this. So on one hand, yes, governments should not interfere unless they absolutely have to. All right, but when they have to, they have the right to do so. I would also note here, not all differences or disparities in wealth are unjust. Some people deserve to have more than others, depending on the work they do, their family size, and other factors. Okay, but the disparities or differences in wealth become unjust when some people have more than they need and other people have less than they need to survive and to achieve full human development. The same applies to nations. Okay, it's unjust when one nation has far more than it needs and other nations have far less than they need. Okay, so not everybody has to be equal. We're not talking about equality, we're talking about equity. Everybody needs to have what they need. Everybody deserves to have what they need to flourish. Okay. Again, Catholic social teaching is focused on integral human development. All right. Finally, Pope Paul's teaching, it shows an important distinction here, that while we do have the right to private property, that right to private property is not absolute. In other words, that right to own property can be taken away. It's subject to the limits of justice, for one thing, and to a principle called the universal destination of goods. Okay? So the universal destination of goods refers to the fact that God intends his creation to be received and enjoyed by every human person. Okay? It's not intended for a subset of human beings, but for all human beings. Therefore, everybody has a right to have access to whatever goods they need for survival and full human development. Okay? We'll talk more about that later. But that's Populorum Progressio. Okay, we'll talk about Humanae Vitae tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your snow day. There's no assignment for today. Just watch this video and take notes on it if you need to. You will need to know it for quiz. All right, bye-bye.